Should we start? We're good? Yep. And we got amplitude. Hopefully aptitude as well. Hey, good morning, everyone. Wow, that was cool. That's the first time anyone's ever told me good morning back in a large audience. That's really cool. So welcome. I apologize. I'm going to try to purposely talk low since I'm mic'd and I talk loud. I don't want to blow your eardrums up first thing in Dreamforce. We'll wait until Bruno Mars for that. But this morning we're going to spend the next 40 or so minutes talking about debugging Salesforce One applications. So hopefully you are in the right spot, or a spot if you were scurrying to find a session to go to. So this, just so you know, the focus of this really is, I would say, sort of introductory kind of level. We're not going to go into a lot of really advanced, crazy things. It's really kind of like how to use the tools and how they interrelate and how we can walk through some examples. So if you're looking for a really super crazy advanced session, everybody will close their eyes while you scurry out the back and act like we didn't see you. But a little bit about myself. My name is Ryan Upton. I've been developing applications on the Salesforce platform for over 6 years now. I was a Salesforce employee for those 6 years until just recently. When I was at Salesforce, I had a number of different roles, from platform architect, spent a little time on the developer evangelism team working with our developer community. And today I'm just off kind of doing some other things. Follow me on Twitter. There's my shameless plug. Ryan J. Upton. All kinds of sundry and interesting things that will be shared with you thusly. I don't know necessarily I need to go to the safe harbor. I'm going to pause here for about 5 minutes while everybody reads this carefully. By the way, let me word this correctly. For whom is this your first Dreamforce? Oh my gosh, that's pretty awesome. Amazing. So if you haven't, the reason why I'm asking, if you haven't been inundated with this yet, stand by. All right. So why do we talk about debugging? Any thoughts? Someone want to answer the question? Any ideas? Say again? The world is full of bugs. Yeah, absolutely. This actually reminds me of one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons. Pointy hair boss gets them all on the table and he says, we're gonna take a different approach. We're gonna start paying you guys $10 for every bug you fix, right? Or find and fix. And everybody's like, yeah, right? And Dilbert leans over to say something to Wally and he's like, not now, I've got to go code myself a minivan, right? So, yeah, so absolutely. But you know, debugging is kind of one of those areas. It's like eating spinach, right? No one really likes to do it. You really don't want to do it. It's kind of unpleasant a lot of times. But you know, by focusing on some of these ideas and understanding what to do and what tools you have available to you on the platform, it allows you to basically grow up big and strong as a developer on the Salesforce platform. So just out of curiosity here, who here develops on other platforms, other tools, frameworks, non-platform, non-Salesforce? Good, so the majority of people, awesome. So that's kind of what I was hoping would be the case, right? Because what you probably already bringing to the table, at least some assumptions I've made of you, is you guys already understand some of the basics of how to debug applications, right? So I'm not going to walk through and say, here's how you debug, blah, blah, blah. What this really is now that you're coming to Salesforce from a different environment, how do you sort of transition what you know, or how do you become introduced to some of the tools and the ideas to make debugging applications on the platform not only possible, but a little bit easier? So we're going to focus on a few things here. Really, everything that we're going to focus around tool-wise revolves around this thing called the debug log. So everybody understands basically, right, that when you run things on Salesforce, execute code, regardless of what it is, whether it's Apex call, saving a record, whatever, it's very transactional, right? So it's basically every time you do something, it generates a single transaction. What the debug log is, effectively, is a log of everything that's happened during that particular transaction. And you can step through this, obviously, and look at a lot of the lower level and granular details about what's happened inside of that transaction. Makes sense, right? Simple. So some of the things that you're going to see really inside the debug log are just that, right? They're going to be system processes as well as database operations. So you're going to see kind of normal transactions and, well, I guess I shouldn't have said that because it's not really, the opposite would be an abnormal, but the regular transactions right, that you're going to see in there. These would be things like if you make an API call, right? The execution of code, obviously, if you're running triggers, if that trigger or some other call out invokes actual Apex. But it also shows you a lot of information about the metadata stuff as well. And everybody has a kind of a good understanding of what we mean by the metadata versus a code, and right? Okay, cool. So you see not only the actual code that's going on, what's happening and stepping through and tracing through the code, but you can also see a lot of metadata information as well. And this is kind of good, right? Because we all want to have access to the metadata as much as to the code, because we all like metadata, right? I've never metadata I didn't like, but and that's way too early for stupid jokes. I apologize. So you're going to see all of those normal transactions, but also keep in mind, guys, that there are certain types of transactions that won't show up in the debug log. Anybody know what they are? Any thoughts?
The one you specifically looking for?
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. I wish I had something to give you for that answer. That's brilliant. Have a water. But yeah, no, absolutely. But it's really a lot of those automatic things that happen inside of Salesforce. Like one real good example is lead conversions, right? That whole lead conversion process when you go through converting a lead and converting them to an account or an opportunity or both. You won't see that happening inside of the debug log. So just keep some of those things in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, guys, is that the system will always generate, I shouldn't say the system, the platform will always generate debug information for the debug log. However, here's kind of a kicker, it doesn't automatically persist it. Right? In order for this data to be persisted, you have to go in and specifically enable debug logs for the user that's going to be running the code. There's also a few things to keep in mind here as well. Just so you know some limits, each user can only have 20 logs. Each log can only be 2 megs in size per user. And also, inside of each org, you can only have a max of 50 megs of logs. So it's kind of important. I throw them out there because you certainly want to keep that in mind, especially when you look at this, right? What goes in, how you really control the log. Actually, it's a combination of, why I was telling you the limits, it's a combination of the filter criteria as well as the debug log levels, right? So the filter criteria is pretty straightforward, right? It lets you basically get information about every database operation that's going on. These are all your data manipulation calls, all your SQL queries, social searches, etc., right? Things here are pretty obvious, like workflow, validations, callouts. Visualforce is kind of interesting, right? Visualforce is an odd bird in debugging, and I actually have a section at the end under special cases where we talk a little bit about Visualforce. But Visualforce contains not only, it won't contain like rendering information, right? It doesn't show you things like if you're using remoting or JavaScript inside of your pages. But what it does show you is it does show you when serialization and deserialization of view state is occurring. So that's some good information there that you might want to take a look at, especially if you're not getting the right data or what you think you should be getting propagated back and forth between the server. And then for each filter criteria, you're going to set a debug log level. The debug log level is basically verbosity, right? So here we're defining what we want in the logs, yes? And here we're defining how much we want in the logs, yes? I don't know why I started talking like Gordon Ramsay all of a sudden. Right, so this kind of goes back to why I was telling you that limit, guys, right? How do you think this might correlate to the debug log limit? The amount of log information. Go ahead. Only if you've got a real answer this time. Okay.
The further down the list you go, the more data is going to be in there.
Yeah.
So if you have validation logs going at fine, what you really want to look for, you may not get to it because the log will finish before you.
That's right. Yeah. So it's the only thing I would add or deviate from that a little bit is if you fill up the 2 megs in log files on a single transaction, it's like, God help you, right? Doom and gloom. You're going to probably hit other limits, quite honestly, before you fill up that. But I'm thinking more long term, right? So eventually you're going to hit that total logging information that's available to you. And you're absolutely right. That's exactly what it is, right? The finer you are, the more verbose you are in your logs. Obviously, the more logs you're going to be generating, so you certainly want to be cognizant of that. Thus, the limit, okay? Yes?
If you reach the limit, does it show the first section or the last section
it rolls over to the newest. So it truncates. You always see what's the latest statistics that have been gathered. All right. So the other thing to keep in mind with the log level is it's global, right? At least a high level. So I'm going to say, hey, let me turn on logging for myself. And I want to grab Apex database visual force information. And I want to set the, I want to do, let's say info, right? Or error. Great, it's global. But again, kind of getting back to is a selection topic. Maybe I don't want to have a global setting for everything, right? Maybe certain classes or certain triggers are problematic, and I want to maybe leave normal debugging for triggers at, let's say, error, right? But for one trigger that's very problematic, kind of tricky, giving me problems, maybe for that one trigger, I just want to start tracing that at a finer or finest level, or something like that. So that's exactly what the filters for Apex classes and triggers allow me to do, right? They basically let me specify the logging and the verbosity on a class-by-class basis, which is a kind of a neat feature. So let me just show you really quickly. Right, so I go, how do I put my browser up and I Alt-Tab, but it's still showing? Do you know how I switch that? I guess I could. Oh, look at that. If only. I got to do that. That's weird. All right. Hold on. I think if I duplicate instead of extend, voila. Okay. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is basically just show you how to turn these on. If you've never done it before, you just go into setup, right? Go down to debug logs, nice and easy. Here we already have mine. I forgot to reset this. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So I simply define who I want to enable them for. Very, very simple. And I control this with filters, right? So here's where I set the filters. I bring this up, guys, because if you've never done this before, one, and two, I highly recommend that you take a look at the, although it's a lot, the events. This is actually all the details of what gets stuck into that log at that particular level. And to the other question as well earlier, let me just actually change a couple of these while I'm in here. So I want to move this down to finest and profiling to finest. So I want to show you something in a minute that's been kind of fickle. It's kind of like half working and half not working, which is really ironic for a debugging session, right? It's like, why don't you go fix it? Hopefully that'll work though as I show it to you. Okay, and then again, right? If I want to delete everything, delete the setting and delete, obviously, if the person's logs are filling up, getting kind of verbose, someone's bogarting all the log space, I can go in and reset it for the person, etc. Pretty simple, yes? Okay. Dun, 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 dun. So now that we've talked a little bit about what we're looking at, I want to share a couple of ways that you can look at it, right? Doing the actual debugging itself. So guys, keep in mind there are a lot of tools out there. That's one of the cool things about the really the vibrant growth in the ecosystem is, there's a lot of people building a lot of really cool tools. I'm only going to talk about two. But I say that because I don't want you to think you're limited to just these two. I'm going to talk about the two that are officially supported by Salesforce. One being the developer console. Has anyone ever used the developer console? Who likes the developer console? Put you on the spot. Yeah, interesting. And the other one being the Force.com IDE. Right? So the developer console basically is a cloud. I like to call it a cloud-based IDE, right? It allows you to do things that normally normal IDEs would. It lets you write code, right? It lets you check code. It lets you create new things. It lets you test SOQL statements. It lets you run anonymous Apex to prototype things and like a REPL type of function. A lot of really good features, right? For those of you that are, like myself, come from more of an on-premises type of world and have been a Java developer, let's say, or other languages where you're familiar with Eclipse, you have the Force.com IDE as an option for you, right? So does anybody use the IDE? Did I already ask that? I think. Cool, so a lot more, that is about 50-50, I guess it looks like. It's a really good tool. This isn't meant to be a knock on what I'm going to say. I'm not going to focus so much on the Force.com IDE because although, in my experience, and you're welcome to disagree with me, it's a really good tool for building code, right, writing stuff into my project, not so good on the debugging side. And the reason being is because really what the IDE gives you access to is just the raw debug log. Now, I shouldn't say like just the raw debug log, like that's not enough. It's enough. The problem is it's like, probably too much in many cases. The good news is it's really, really rich, very verbose, and very detailed. The bad news is it's really rich, verbose, and detailed, right? So it can be kind of difficult for more trickier types of exceptions and issues. Sometimes harder to find things, or to find things at a lower level or the level you want to. So you'll see here my little Venn diagram, right? It does provide some common thing. There is some common overlap between the two, like log filters, the ability to execute anonymous and trace through anonymous code if you want to do, test out some profiling, prototyping, and have issues with there. The ability to run your test classes, obviously kind of testing and debugging go hand in hand, yes. And then access, as I just said, to the raw log. There is one thing that the IDE does give you that the developer console doesn't, which I think is really cool, and that is the ability to work with multiple projects simultaneously. So that's kind of a nice trade-off for all the other cool stuff we're going to see, right? So a lot of the focus, obviously, are on the tools that have been built into the developer console because I think that it gives you a little bit richer access to really to the debug logs. Okay. Right. So one thing I also like to say about the debug log is for any of you guys that are like old school, like hardcore systems developers or anything like that, I like to, and I guess you don't really have to be that to know what I'm getting ready to say if you have experience with it. What I like to think of the debug log is kind of like a core dump in a way of your application, right? Because if you're going to use a regular debugger that you're typically used to working with, like let's say a Java debugger or something like that, you're going to see it's a little bit different when you try to do this in a live environment where things never stop, right? And you can't really like attach and put breakpoints into the platform because there's really no way to stop it. So what you're going to find is the things we talk about, it's usually more like I would say like a static analysis of what's gone on, statistics that have been collected at a specific point in time. What is that point in time? It's when that execution ran, or yeah, that's a little redundant. It's when that transaction ran that just finished. So we collect the statistics that we define around there. Okay, so how do we view things? All right, so there's a few different ways. I'm going to start with sort of the old school approach. Has anybody ever used the system debug statement? It's good, right? It works well, yeah? It's probably, I call it the workhorse of the platform for debugging, right? It's easy to use. It gives you good information, generally, and there's some flexibility with it. By default, understand, guys, that there is an overloaded form of this. As you can see, the regular form basically just takes a string and inserts it at the level that generated the error, right? So if I run this system debug for something that created an error or info or whatever, that's going to be the log level that this message is associated with. Keep that in mind if you're using this in combination with different log level settings and you're wondering why maybe sometimes you don't see your system debug statements popping out. Okay. The other option is you can specify not only the message but the logging level as well. Pretty straightforward. The other option that you have, and this is probably one of my favorite additions, are checkpoints, right? So you could think of checkpoints as being kind of like breakpoints, but not really breakpoints, okay? Because again, with a breakpoint, what are you doing? You're breaking, you're stopping execution at a point in time, right? You can't do that on the platform. So what we're doing, this kind of goes back to my whole thing, this is like taking like GDB and attaching it to a core dump, right? You can then take that and then step through everything that's gone on from that point on. The other thing to keep in mind, guys, here's something that's very subtle, but people sometimes forget. There are times when I really probably could not use a system debug statement to debug or to help solve a problem. Does anybody know when that might be? Well, yeah. Someone was paying attention. No, that's not. That's good. If I'm in there doing some like emergency debugging in a production environment, right, I'm not going to be able to slap a system debug statement into existing code base, right, that I have deployed in that production environment. So in that case, if for some reason code that's already been tested and pushed out is acting weird all of a sudden, it's going to be very difficult in that case to trace it. However, a checkpoint gives me the ability to do that. Right? So I can define a checkpoint anywhere inside the code that I want to take a look at. Okay, so very similar to a breakpoint for those of you familiar with debugging in the sense that it looks like we broke, right, and that we gather statistics around where you define that checkpoint, but it doesn't actually do that. Okay, one thing to keep in mind too, guys, is typically this varies a little bit depending upon what you put the checkpoint on. But the statistics typically get executed or gathered like right before that line where you put your checkpoint, right? The other thing to keep in mind too is that when we gather statistics, we only gather statistic once, regardless of how many times that code gets executed. So what does that mean? Well, let's say that I have a checkpoint inside a loop, right? The statistics are going to get collected one time going into that loop rather than every time in that loop, which seems kind of like, well, that's worthless, right? Especially if I wanted to trace through all the loop. That's where this thing called the iterator comes into place, which is why I say the checkpoint iteration makes this not lame, right? Because it actually lets you say, okay, let me move the iterator forward to, let's say, the next part in that loop or whatever. And I'm just using a really simple example, all right? So again, there's a lot of bias in here, obviously, as you can tell with my verbiage. But I think personally one of the neatest features of checkpoints is the ability to do something at them. Right? Not only can you see everything that's going on inside and around that checkpoint, but you can also do other things in them to get more information or to like test and correlate with other things if you need to. And you can do that by either creating additional SOQL a query or inserting and writing Apex code at a checkpoint. Here's a neat little trick too with Apex code at a checkpoint in a production environment. You can still use your system debug statement. It's just that at your checkpoint you put in code that says system debug whatever. Right? So silly little trick. I'm going to show you another one which kind of makes that a moot point here when we get to it. Okay. So all of these things now inside of the developer console are presented to you, the developers, inside of something called a perspective. Perspective is a very difficult word, by the way, to get a good definition for. If you don't, just for fun, go look it up sometime. So the definition that I found that I think most adequately defines simplistically what the perspective is, it gives you the ability to view things within their true relations and relative importance to each other. And if you think about it, kind of makes sense, right? Stack tree, variables, right? Things going on inside of different code blocks. What if I'm calling a trigger that calls another Apex code? Save the trigger, goes off and creates a workflow. Workflow comes back in, causes a trigger rule to fire again. You kind of want to know those relationships and interrelationships amongst all those moving parts if you're trying to debug them, yes? Right? So it's really kind of the nice thing about a perspective. So inside of the console, you have, let me just show you real quick, I recently switched back to Windows, so you'll have to bear with me on this, guys. Sorry again, I forgot to move it down. There we go. Let me open the developer console. So you have inside of these, that was odd. Yeah, I think I do, somewhere along the line. There we go. So you have these predefined perspectives. Right, and you can actually change these as well. I won't show you how, but you can go in and modify like which one's your default and things like that. But what the perspectives basically give you inside of the console are a set of panels that provides different views into the things you're trying to solve. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. So I already talked about the log inspector, right? This is basically the view into the raw debug log. I've already talked about everything that you see in it, so I'm not going to bore everybody by repeating this. You also have two panels for your stack tree and your execution stack. So the stack tree is basically a top-down view, just like you would think of a stack, right? The last thing that executed is at the top of the stack. You could trace all the way down to the inception or the initial point into the stack trace to get an idea of what's going on. What's kind of cool about this is that, and I'll show you this too, as you're actually stepping through the stack trace, if you have other panels open in your perspective, it will show you the related pieces, right? So if I'm going through the stack trace at a part where I was executing a piece of Apex code, it'll actually pop open the source code, my little source view in the Apex code, and I can in turn click it and go into the source and make an edit or a change if I find where the problem is as I'm doing that. So kind of nice. The stack tree does give you a dual tab view. So there's two pieces here. There's what we call the execution tree as well as the performance tree. The execution tree, pretty straightforward. As I just said, that's what shows you the operation, what that was called. The performance tree is actually going to be the same thing in a way, but it's more of an aggregate view. So let me actually just show you a real quick example of that. Not there. Hold on. So let me just run just some real simple anonymous Apex here. Real simple. Go ahead and execute that. So we start in the logs view, right? The logs view, I'll open that up into my execution log. So here's the log file I was talking about. And if I go look at the stack tree, right, you'll see that basically what it does, right, is it shows every iteration that I went through in that loop. Which is kind of cool too, because it does give you a little bit of opening the kimono in a way, right? And that you can see like what a for loop actually does in terms of system calls. So these are kind of neat little things that even if you're not debugging an actual problem, it's kind of cool just to walk through and see what's going on behind the scenes sometimes. So you see, right, that basically it shows me duration and the amount of heap that's been allocated at each one of those iterations, which is kind of a pain in the butt if I have a lot of them, in this case like 20 or so. What a performance tree does, it's best I think to show you rather than just tell you, performance tree shows you the same thing, but it's just much more at an aggregated level. So here is for all of those iterations, all of those loops, right? Here is how long it took. Here's how many times I went through it, right? And zero heap because I write tight code. Now, like I said, I did nothing, right? It's just a stupid loop that walked through it. But yeah. All right. Get the right one of these. There we go. Okay. So fairly straightforward, right? Talked about the executions. Okay, source and variables. This is, again, another pretty cool option or cool tab. The source code basically shows you, as you would think, the source code, right, that's been executed at that point in the execution log. But it also shows you the metadata for those elements as well. So if I'm tracing through a complex execution log, I hit a line that's maybe running code in a trigger or making a call out to Apex, that'll show up in my source view, the actual raw code that I wrote. But if I click down to the next line where maybe saving that trigger creates or kicks off a workflow, I'll also see that pop up in the list as well. And I can trace through all of the steps of that workflow. Pretty cool if you think about it. Tracing through workflows and things like that are usually like one of the harder things to do if they're not behaving exactly the same way that you think they are. All right. So as I mentioned, you can also click the open button. This opens up the code. I actually discovered, I didn't update this, I should have, the bullet point, the first one there, this doesn't work for metadata components. It kind of does. It depends on what the metadata component is, actually. Workflow is an example. If I go through a workflow, when I first hit that first line, it'll pop up a little JSON block of JSON in my source view that basically shows me the filter criterias, the actions, the action steps, all of those things. I can see exactly what's going on. And here's the cool thing. If I were to click open while that's visible, it actually takes me into the workflow definition inside of Salesforce, opens it up in a new tab and drops me right into that definition of the workflow, so I can go in and edit and debug that a little bit more. Right. And then variables. Variables, again, this gives me the ability to see when a variable has been assigned and given a scope, I can see what that is, right, as you would expect. Again, very subtle, but very powerful. So keep in mind with some of these guys, you do have to, you are, I don't know if constrained is the right word, forced to use certain logging levels. For example, if I want to use variables, I have to have finest set on whatever I'm tracing, Apex, whatever the case may be. Make sense? Okay. All right. Yeah. And then the execution overview. This is pretty neat as well. This is a comprehensive overview of basically everything that's happened. Right? This is also a really good way to debug performance issues across the board, not only with Apex, not only with metadata components, but also with Visualforce elements. So when you run the execution overview, it will show you exactly what's gone on up to that point. So let's take let me just do a real quick example of that with this really cheesy test class that I wrote. Let me close out some of these older logs, and I should have, yep, there it is. Here's my test class. Really simple, stupid test class. Let me get rid of these two lines here. There's a breakpoint, by the way. The way I set them is just like most IDEs. I just click in the gutter where I want to set them. Sorry, it's not a breakpoint. See who's paying attention. It's not a breakpoint, it's a checkpoint. Yes, that's right. All right, so let me go ahead and run this test. And if all works well, oops. Actually, I should see, yep, there we go, what's going on in the execution overview. So in this case, two simple things happen, right? I executed a validation rule, and then I turned around that validation rule when it passed, when the record was saved. In this case, if anybody's familiar with I'm not very original on this one, I just used the workshop warehouse example for those of you that are familiar with that. If not, grab the workbook and you can see what I'm talking about. But basically, created a line item. As soon as I saved it, validation rule passed, saved, commits to the database, causes a workflow to kick off. That workflow is simple. It doesn't do any other updates or cause the lifecycle, the trigger to come back into scope. So pretty straightforward. What I don't see here is I would also have colors for red and orange. Red and orange are before and after triggers. So if I have triggers on here, I would see that in the execution order as well. And then, of course, Visualforce. What's kind of nice about this too, guys, again, timeline. Shows you how long each component took. Execution limits, a lot of really rich information, as you can see here, specifically related to the individual components. All right, so for sockles, workflows, down the line. And then my personal favorite, the bane of every platform developer in the world, limits. And I didn't set my profiling to finest, so I don't see that. But where else can I see the limits? I can also see the limits, by the way, if you guys were unfamiliar with this. The limits are in the raw log as well. A little harder to work with is in this case, which is why I recommend filtering and some of the other tools. All right, so the execution overview. All right, so this actually brings us to Apex governor limits. There's a few other things that we've seen, some tools now, some basic ideas and concepts, some things to keep in mind. Right, Salesforce, as we all are familiar with, is a different world, right? One of those things that's different, not only in terms of debugging and the fact that we can't stop the world and debug applications like we might normally do, is the fact that we're also working up against or have to be cognizant of governor limits. So governor limits aren't a bad thing, regardless of what we want to think of them, right? Regardless of the many number of times they've caused us to say, son of a, or what the, right, as you're writing code. But they're there simply to enforce the really good behavior in a multi-tenant environment, right? Making sure that no one application or code bogarts all of the system resources. I throw them out here, guys, because from a debugging point of view, these are often the cause of very non-obvious problems. And as I said, the best way to look at them is to grab the system log or to look at the execution overview and look very specifically at what limits you're being executed. One of the things you're going to see a lot of times, someone has probably seen the 101 error. I'll just use the numbers. Anybody familiar with that one? Too many SOQL queries, right? And you look at your code and you're like, I'm only running like 1 or 2 queries, right? Obviously, I mean, when I say obviously, it's on first glance. But being able to trace through this and say, oh yeah, look, I'm kicking off a workflow here that's kicking off another workflow that, son of a, right? This is a managed package that I put in here that's also running workflows because of that now. And, lo and behold, I'm running a boatload, to use a technical term, of queries that I didn't expect, right? And there's really no other way that you're going to see that without tracing through the log stuff. I mean, I guess you could do the brute force way and trap all the way through there, but pretty crazy. The moral of this story, ladies and gentlemen, is just be familiar with them. Learn what they are, some of the more common ones. This is all well-documented stuff, which is one of the reasons I didn't make it redundant. And this does show up in your debug log, which is good. So it's not like, well, maybe it's a problem with limit or not. It's going to be very obvious when you look in there that you're hitting into the problem. So a couple of other special considerations just here in wrapping up. One, triggers. Anybody here written triggers? Does anybody here have ever had a trigger bite you in the backside? Yep. So triggers are an interesting, very powerful, very cool, probably one of the best features, but they're very, very interesting beast. Why they're interesting is because they do come with a very complex life cycle associated with them. Okay? So the trigger life cycle, order of execution, again, it's very publicly available through the developer docs. Know it and live it. This, by knowing the order of execution and little subtleties like if I do a field update, it's going to cause all of my triggers to run unless it's at a specific point in a specific type of trigger. Knowing those kinds of things implicitly will certainly help you so you don't even have to go down the path of doing a lot of deep debugging. And unfortunately, those are kinds of things that are not so obvious when you're trying to debug. I mean, you can see where things are getting executed, but you're still left scratching your head saying why, right? Unless you know those things implicitly. And they also, of course, have a cascading effect with data, related data, etc. Visual Force is also an interesting one, right? Because with Visual Force, there's a lot of different things that are kind of going on in the page, depending upon what you're doing in the page. You could have problems with the rendering of Visual Force elements, right? The data binding behind the Visual Force elements, especially if you're using like record sets and things like that and trying to iterate through like a page block table or whatever the case may be. So variable and data binding, as I said, a couple of things you can do debugging within Salesforce on this is looking at the variables stack or the variables window as you're tracing through, and also looking at the view state as it's going back and forth, be serialization and deserialization. Performance, again, that's kind of a tricky one in Pages especially. One other thing that can help you very directly with what we've seen today would be the execution overview tab. Your problem in Visual is your problem in JavaScript, is it in tag rendering. Those typically are where you want to use a combination of tools, not only the overview console or the developer console, and things we talked about today, but also things that are built into your browser, right? Like the developer tools in Chrome and things like that that'll give you those different view and better view into things. I was like, I hate when I do that, like something right on the tip of my tongue and it's gone now. Maybe it'll come back. If I shout out something randomly, you'll know that I just thought of it. So debugging workflows are also kind of interesting, right? Debugging workflows is a little different. The things really that you want to look for in your stack trace are what I call the WF star, right? These are all the workflow actions. These are things that are triggering different things, whether it's entering the workflow, evaluating the criteria of the workflow, kicking off actions, what that action is it a field update, is it an email notification, is it an alert, whatever the case may be. These are also very easy and obvious to see too. As I said, a lot of these are going to be associated with JSON as you're viewing the source in them inside the window, which again, I think gives you a much better view and clarity into where the problem actually lies. Right at the right time too. That's pretty good. I'm usually too verbose. So Any questions, guys, before we wrap up? We have a few minutes. If you're too shy to ask questions, feel free to grab me up here or whatever. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned checkpoints are available in production.
Yes.
So would I just set up a login for
Yeah.
profile?
That's right. That's right. But one thing I would recommend to do is go back in and kill that log that you created just for that user, right? Because you don't want to gather that information typically in that production environment after you solve the problem, right? Yep. Cool. What else? Yes. Not aside from what we went through, yeah. Like I say, Salesforce is a different world, right? Because you can't stop things to poke around and inspect and stack up and down the stack trace, right? It's very dynamic and always moving, very fluid. So really the options you have is kind of almost like forensic analysis, I guess, right? You kind of see what happened up to that point, right? And kind of back engineer it, I guess, from there. Yeah. Hi.
And you said the filters, it applies to them, right?
Yes.
But do you know any trick things that allow to apply filters at once? And because now if you click reset, they will
Yeah,
be
they're gone.
reset.
Yeah.
So it's very...
I don't know of a way to like define, like have a preset template if